Chapter 21. Accumulation and Reproduction on an Expanded Scale. We showed in Volume 1 how accumulation proceeds for the individual capitalist. The realization of his commodity capital also brings with it the realization of the surplus product in which his surplus value is represented. The surplus value that is transformed into money in this way is then transformed back by the capitalist into additional natural elements of his productive capital. In the next production circuit, the increased capital supplies an increased product. But what occurs in the case of an individual capital must also occur in the overall annual reproduction, just as we have seen that what in the case of the individual capital is the successive precipitation of its worn-out fixed components in money that is hoarded up also finds its expression in the annual social reproduction. If an individual capital is 400C plus 100V, and the year's surplus value 100, then its commodity product is 400C plus 100V plus 100S. This 600 is transformed into money. Of this money, 400C is converted back into the natural form of constant capital, 100C into labor power, and, if the entire surplus value is accumulated, the remaining 100S transformed into additional constant capital by conversion into the natural elements of productive capital. It is assumed here, 1. That this sum is sufficient under the given technical conditions, either for the extension of the constant capital already functioning or for the installation of a new industrial business. It may be necessary, however, to transform surplus value into money and hoard this money for a much longer time before this process takes place, i.e. before real accumulation and expansion of production can occur. It is presupposed that there has in fact already been reproduction on an expanded scale, for in order to be able to transform the money, the surplus value hoarded up in money, into elements of productive capital, these elements must be available on the market as commodities, and it makes no difference here if they are not bought as ready-made commodities, but are produced to order. They are paid for only when they are ready, and in any case, only after real reproduction on an expanded scale, the extension of what was formerly normal production, has already taken place as far as they are concerned. They had to exist potentially, i.e. in their elements, since it only needed the impulse of the order, i.e. of a purchase of the commodities preceding their existence and their anticipated sale, for their production actually to take place. The money on one side calls into being expanded reproduction on the other only because the possibility of this already exists without the money, for money in itself is not an element of real production. If capitalist A, for example, sells the quantities of commodity product that he successfully produced in the course of a year or a number of years, then he thereby successively transforms that part of his commodity product that is the bearer of surplus value, the surplus product, i.e. the surplus value that he produced in the commodity form, into money, stores this away bit by bit, and in this way forms for himself potential new money capital, potential on account of its capacity and its destiny, which is to be converted into elements of productive capital. In fact, however, he only performs simple hoard formation, which is not an element of real reproduction. His activity in this connection consists first of all simply in the successive withdrawal of circulating money from the circulation sphere, and it is of course not excluded here that the circulating money that he puts under lock and key was itself, before its entry into circulation, part of another hoard. This hoard of A's, which is potentially new money capital, is not an addition to the social wealth any more than if it had been spent on means of consumption. Money that is withdrawn from currency, and which therefore was previously in the circulation sphere, may before that have either been already stored up once as a similar hoard, may have been the money form of wages, may have realized means of production or other commodities, or may have circulated constant capital components or revenue for some capitalist or other. It is no more new wealth than money considered from the standpoint of simple commodity circulation is the bearer not just of its actual value, but of 10 times its value, simply because it is turned over 10 times in a day, and realized 10 different commodity values. The commodities still exist without it, and it remains the same, or even becomes less by wear and tear, in one turnover or in 10. Only in gold production, insofar as the gold product contains or is a bearer of surplus value, is new wealth, that is potential money, created, and it is only to the extent that the whole of the new gold product steps into circulation that it increases the money material for potential new money capitals. But even though it is not additional new social wealth, this surplus value hoarded up in the money form does represent new potential money capital, on account of the function for which it is stored. We shall see later that new money capital can also arise by another path than that of the gradual realization of surplus value. Money is withdrawn from circulation and stored up as a hoard by the sale of commodities without subsequent purchase. If this operation is conceived as taking place on all sides, it seems impossible to explain where the buyers are to come from, since in this process, and it must be conceived as a general one, inasmuch as every individual capital may be simultaneously engaged in the act of accumulation, everyone wants to sell in order to hoard, and no one wants to buy. If the circulation process between the various parts of the annual reproduction were conceived as rectilinear, which would be incorrect since, with few exceptions, it always consists of mutually opposing movements, then we would have to begin with the gold, or silver, producer, who buys without selling, and assume that all others sell to him. The total annual social surplus product, which is the repository of the entire surplus value, would therefore be transferred to him, and all the other capitalists would divide up his surplus product among themselves in due proportion in its natural gold form, the realization in kind of his surplus value. For the part of the gold producer's product that has to replace his functioning capital is already tied up and disposed of. The surplus value of the gold producer, produced in gold, would then be the only fund from which all the other capitalists drew the material with which to realize their annual surplus product. It would thus have to be equal in value to the entire annual surplus value of the society, which first has to be transmogrified into the form of a hoard. These assumptions are so absurd that they are only helpful towards explaining the possibility of a general simultaneous hoard formation, and do not take reproduction itself, except that of the gold producers, a single step forwards. Before we clear up this apparent difficulty, we have to distinguish between accumulation in Department 1, production of means of production, and accumulation in Department 2, production of means of consumption. We start with Department 1. Section 1. Accumulation in Department 1. Subsection A. Hoard formation. It is evident that both capital investment in the several branches of industry that Department 1 consists of, and the various individual capital investments within each of these branches of industry, are to be found at different stages in the process of their successive transformation of surplus value into potential money capital. This holds whether this money capital is to serve for the expansion of the functioning capital or for the installation of new industrial businesses, the two forms of expansion of production. One section of capitalists, therefore, at any given time, is transforming its potential money capital, which has grown to an appropriate size, into productive capital, i.e. using the money it has hoarded up by the realization of surplus value to buy means of production, additional elements of constant capital, while another section is still occupied with hoarding up its potential money capital. Capitalists belonging to these two categories thus relate to one another as buyers and sellers respectively, and each of the two in this exclusive role. Let A sell 600, being 400C plus 100V and 100S, to B, who may represent more than one buyer. He has sold commodities with a value of 600 in exchange for 600 in money, of which 100 represents surplus value that he withdraws from circulation and hoards up. This 100, however, is only the money form of a surplus product that was the bearer of a value of 100. Hoard formation is in no case production, and thus from the start not an increment to production. The action of the capitalist here consists in simply withdrawing from circulation the money he obtained by selling his surplus product, holding on to it, and impounding it. This operation is not just performed by A, but at numerous points on the circulation surface by other capitalists, A prime, etc., who all work equally zealously at this kind of hoard formation. These several points at which money is withdrawn from circulation and accumulated in individual hoards or potential money capitals appear as an equal number of obstacles to circulation, because they immobilize the money and deprive it of its capacity for circulation for a longer or shorter time. It must be borne in mind, however, that with simple commodity circulation, long before this is founded on capitalist commodity production, there is already hoard formation. The quantity of money present in the society is always greater than the part of this that is in active circulation, even if the latter rises and falls according to circumstances. It is the same hoards and the same hoard formation that are found within capitalist production too, but now is an imminent moment of the capitalist production process. It is easy to understand the satisfaction evinced when the credit system concentrates all these potential capitals in the hands of banks, etc., makes them into disposable capital, loanable capital, i.e. money capital, no longer passive and, as it were, a castle in the air, but active, usurious, proliferating capital. However, A can bring about this hoard formation only insofar as he appears, as far as his surplus product goes, simply as a seller, and not also subsequently as a buyer. The precondition for his hoard formation is thus his successive production of surplus product, the repository of his surplus value that is to be realized. In the given case, where we are considering only circulation within Department 1, the natural form of the surplus product, like that of the whole product of which it forms part, is the natural form of an element of constant capital in Department 1, i.e. it belongs to the category of means of production of means of production. What becomes of this, i.e. what function it serves in the hands of buyers B, B prime, B prime prime, etc., we shall soon see. What has first to be established is this. Even though A withdraws money from circulation for his surplus value and hoards it, he casts commodities into circulation, on the other hand, without withdrawing other commodities for these. This enables B, B prime, B prime prime, etc., for their part, simply to cast money into circulation and withdraw commodities. In the present case, these commodities are suited by their natural form to enter the constant capital of B, B prime, etc., as a fixed or fluid element, and are in fact destined to this end. We shall have more to say on this as soon as we have finished with the buyers of the surplus product, B, B prime, etc. We must note here in passing that, just as previously when we were considering simple reproduction, so we find here again that the reconversion of the various components of the annual product, i.e. their circulation, which must also include the reproduction of capital, and moreover its restoration and its different determinations as constant, variable, fixed, circulating money or commodity capital, in no way presupposes simply the purchase of commodities supplemented by a subsequent sale, or a sale supplemented by a subsequent purchase, so that there would be just a simple exchange of one commodity for another, as the free trade school have assumed from the physiocrats and Adam Smith onwards. We know that the fixed capital, once the outlay on it has been made, is not renewed for the whole of the period during which it functions, but continues to operate in its old form, while its value is gradually precipitated out in money. We see now that the periodic renewal of the fixed capital portion of 2C, the entire capital value 2C being exchanged for elements to the value of 1V plus S, presupposes on the one hand a one-sided purchase of that fixed part of 2C which is transformed back from the money form into the natural form, and to which corresponds a one-sided sale of 1S. On the other hand, it presupposes a one-sided sale on the part of 2C, the sale of that fixed value component, wear and tear, which is precipitated out in money, and to which corresponds a one-sided purchase of 1S. In order that the exchange should take place normally, it has to be assumed that the one-sided purchase by 2C is equal in value to its one-sided sale, and similarly, that the one-sided sale of 1S to 2C, Section 1, is equal to its one-sided purchase from 2C, Section 2. See page 540. Otherwise, simple reproduction would be disrupted. The one-sided purchase at one point must be covered by a one-sided sale at another. It has similarly to be assumed in the present case that the one-sided sales by the hoard-forming section of 1S, A prime, A prime prime, balance the one-sided purchases by section B, B prime, B prime prime of 1S, which transforms their hoards into elements of additional productive capital. To the extent that the balance is restored by the fact that the buyer subsequently appears as a seller, and vice versa, to the full amount of the value involved, there is a reflux of money to the side that advanced it for the purchase, that which first sold before purchasing again. The real balance, however, as far as the actual commodity exchange is concerned, i.e. the reconversion of the various parts of the annual product, requires that equal values of commodities are reciprocally exchanged. Inasmuch as one-sided conversions take place, a number of mere purchases on the one hand and isolated sales on the other, and as we have seen, the normal exchange of the annual product on the capitalist basis requires these one-sided metamorphoses, this balance exists only on the assumption that the values of the one-sided purchases and the one-sided sales cover each other. The fact that the production of commodities is the general form of capitalist production already implies that money plays a role, not just as means of circulation, but also as money capital within the circulation sphere, and gives rise to certain conditions for normal exchange that are peculiar to this mode of production, i.e. conditions for the normal course of reproduction, whether simple or on an expanded scale, which turn into an equal number of conditions for an abnormal course, possibilities of crisis, since, on the basis of the spontaneous pattern of this production, this balance is itself an accident. We have seen similarly that in the exchange of 1V for a corresponding value of 2C, commodities 2 are ultimately replaced for 2C by the same value of commodities 1, and therefore that on part of the collective capitalist 2, a sale of his own commodity is subsequently supplemented by a purchase of commodities 1 to the same amount. This replacement actually does take place, but in this mutual conversion of their reciprocal commodities, there is no direct exchange between capitalist 1 and 2. Capitalist 2 sells his commodities 2C to the working class of Department 1, which faces him one-sidedly as a buyer of commodities, with him facing it similarly as simply a seller of commodities. With the money received for these, 2C one-sidedly faces the collective capitalist 1 as a buyer of commodities, and the latter faces him one-sidedly in turn as a seller of commodities to the value of 1V. It is only by this sale of commodities that Department 1 finally reproduces its variable capital in the form of money capital. If Department 1's capital one-sidedly faces that of Department 2 as a seller of commodities to the amount of 1V, similarly, it faces the Department 1 working class as a buyer of commodities with the purchase of its labor power. The Department 1 working class one-sidedly faces the capitalists in Class 2 as a buyer of commodities, i.e. as a buyer of means of subsistence, and it faces the capitalists in Department 1 one-sidedly as a seller of commodities, i.e. as a seller of its labor power. The continuous supply of labor power on the part of the working class in Department 1, the transformation of one part of Department 1's commodity capital back into the money form of variable capital, the replacement of a part of Department 2's commodity capital by natural elements of constant capital 2C, these necessary preconditions all mutually require one another, but they are mediated by a very complicated process which involves three processes of circulation that proceed independently, even if they are intertwined with one another. The very complexity of the process provides many occasions for it to take an abnormal course. Subsection B. The additional constant capital. The surplus product, the repository of surplus value, does not cost anything to its appropriators, here the capitalists in Department 1. They do not have to advance either money or commodities in any form in order to receive it. The advance already meant for the physiocrats simply the general form of value realized in the elements of productive capital. What the capitalists advance, therefore, is nothing more than their constant and variable capital. The worker does not merely maintain their constant capital for them by way of his labor and replace their variable capital by way of a corresponding portion of value newly created in the form of commodities, he also supplies them, by his surplus labor, with a surplus value existing in the form of a surplus product. By their subsequent sale of this surplus product, the capitalists form their hoard, additional potential money capital. In the case considered here, this surplus product consists from the start of means of production of means of production. It is only in the hands of B, B prime, B prime prime, etc., Department 1, that this surplus product functions as additional constant capital. But it is already virtually this, even before it is sold in the hands of the hoard formers A prime, A prime, Department 1. If we simply consider the level of reproduction on the part of Department 1 in value terms, then we still find ourselves within the limits of simple reproduction, for no additional capital has been set in motion in order to create this virtual excess of constant capital, the surplus product, and no more surplus labor than was performed on the basis of simple reproduction. The distinction here lies only in the form of the surplus labor applied, the concrete character of its particular useful mode. It has been spent on means of production for 1C instead of 2C, on means of production for means of production instead of on means of production for means of consumption. In the case of simple reproduction, it was assumed that the whole of the surplus value in Department 1 was spent as revenue, i.e. on commodities from Department 2. It consisted only of those means of production needed to replace the constant capital 2C in its natural form. Thus, in order to make the transition from simple reproduction to expanded reproduction, production in Department 1 must be in a position to produce fewer elements of constant capital for Department 2, but all the more for Department 1. This transition, which can never be achieved without difficulty, is made easier by the fact that a number of the products of Department 1 can serve as means of production in both departments. It follows, therefore, that, simply considering the values involved, the material substratum for expanded reproduction is produced in the course of simple reproduction. It is simply the surplus labor of the working class in Department 1 that is spent directly in the production of means of production, in the creation of virtual extra capital in Department 1. The formation of virtual additional money capital on the part of A prime, that is Department 1, by the subsequent sale of their surplus product, which has been formed without any monetary expenditure by the capitalists involved, is thus here simply the money form of extra production of means of production in Department 1. Thus, the production of virtual additional capital, in the present case, for as we shall see it can be formed quite differently, expresses nothing but a phenomenon of the production process itself, the production, in a particular form, of elements of productive capital. The large-scale production of additional virtual money capital, at numerous points on the surface of circulation, is therefore nothing more than the result and expression of the many-sided production of virtual additional productive capital, whose genesis does not itself presuppose any additional monetary expenditure on the part of the industrial capitalists. The successive transformation of this virtual additional productive capital into virtual money capital, that is a hoard, on the part of A prime, etc., which is conditioned by the successive sale of their surplus product, i.e. by the repeated one-sided sale of commodities without a complementary purchase, results in the repeated withdrawal of money from circulation and a corresponding hoard formation. This hoard formation, except in the case where the buyer is a gold producer, in no way implies additional wealth in precious metals, but only a different function for the money that was already in circulation previously. It formerly functioned as a means of circulation, and now it functions as a hoard, as a virtual new money capital in the course of formation. The formation of additional money capital and the quantity of precious metal existing in a country thus do not stand in any causal connection with one another. It also follows from this that the greater the productive capital already functioning in a country, including the labor power incorporated into it, the creator of the surplus product, and the more developed the productive power of labor, and so also the technical means of rapid expansion of the production of means of production, the greater accordingly the mass of surplus product, both in value terms and in the quantity of use values in which it is represented. The greater then is 1. The additional virtual productive capital in the form of surplus product in the hands of A prime, etc., and 2. The quantity of this surplus product transformed into money, i.e. the quantity of the additional virtual money capital in the hands of A prime. Thus, if Fullerton, for instance, is not one to recognize overproduction in the customary sense, but does recognize the overproduction of capital, in particular of money capital, this proves once again how utterly unable even the best bourgeois economists are to understand the mechanism of their system. If the surplus product directly produced and appropriated by the capitalist A prime, is the real basis for capital accumulation, i.e. for expanded reproduction, even though it actually functions in this capacity only in the hands of B prime, etc., it is however absolutely unproductive in its monetary metamorphosis, as a hoard and as virtual money capital that is formed bit by bit. In this form it runs parallel with the production process, but lies outside it. It is a dead weight on capitalist production. The attempt to make use of this surplus value that is being hoarded up as virtual money capital, either for profit or for revenue, culminates in the credit system and papers. In this way, money capital maintains an enormous influence in another form on the course of the capitalist system of production and its prodigious development. The surplus product converted into virtual money capital becomes quantitatively greater, the greater the total sum of capital already functioning from the functioning of which it emerged. This absolute increase in the virtual money capital annually reproduced, however, also makes its segmentation more easy to achieve so that it can be invested more quickly in a particular business, whether in the hands of the same capitalist or in others, for example, members of the family with inheritances, etc. By segmentation of money capital, we mean here that it is completely separated from its parent capital in order to be invested as new money capital in an independent business. If the sellers of the surplus product, A prime, etc., themselves received this as the direct outcome of the production process, which, apart from the advance in constant and variable capital that is required even in the case of simple reproduction, does not presuppose any further act of circulation. If it is also to supply the real basis for reproduction on an expanded scale, in actual fact to create virtual additional capital, it is different for B prime, etc. 1. It is only in their hands that the surplus product of A prime, etc. actually functions as additional constant capital, the other element of the productive capital, the additional labor power, i.e. the additional variable capital, we leave out of consideration for the time being. 2. In order for it to come into their hands, an act of circulation is required. They have to buy the surplus product. On point 1, it must be noted here that a major part of the surplus product, produced by A prime, etc., even though it is produced in the current year, can actually function only in the hands of B prime, etc., as industrial capital in the following year or even later. On point 2, the question arises as to the origin of the money needed for this circulation process. Insofar as the products that B, B', etc. produce go back again into their own production process and kind, it is self-evident that a part of their own surplus product is proportionately transferred directly into their productive capital, and functions here as an extra element of constant capital. To this extent, however, these cannot realize the surplus product of A', etc. But in other cases, where does the money come from? We know that B, B', etc. have formed their hoards just like A and A' by the sale of their respective surplus products and have now reached the point at which their money capital, which is simply virtual money capital accumulated as a hoard, is supposed to function effectively as additional money capital. But now we're going round in circles. There is still the question as to the origin of the money that B's, Department 1, have earlier withdrawn from circulation and accumulated. We already know, however, from considering simple reproduction, that a certain quantity of money must exist in the hands of the capitalists in Departments 1 and 2 so that they may exchange their surplus product. There, the money whose only use was to be spent as revenue on means of consumption returns to the capitalists to the extent that they advanced it for the exchange of their respective commodities. Here, the same money similarly reappears, but with its function changed. The A's and B's of Department 1 supply one another with the money for transforming their surplus products into additional virtual money capital, and alternately cast the newly formed money capital into the circulation sphere as a means of purchase. The only thing that is presupposed here is that the quantity of money existing in the country, the velocity of circulation, etc., taken as constant, is sufficient both for active circulation and for the reserve hoards, i.e. the same condition that, as we already saw previously, has to be fulfilled for simple commodity circulation. It is just that the function of the hoards is different here. The quantity of money present must also be larger. One, because, in the case of capitalist production, all products, with the exception of newly produced precious metal and the few products used by their own producers, are produced as commodities, and must therefore undergo a metamorphosis into money. Two, because the mass of commodity capital and its value is not only absolutely greater on the capitalist basis, but grows with incomparably greater speed. Three, because the variable capital that has to be converted into money capital is ever more extensive. And four, because as production expands, the formation of new money capital keeps in step with this expansion, and so the material for its hoarded form has also to be present. If this is true, absolutely, for the early phase of capitalist production, where the credit system is accompanied by a predominantly metallic circulation, it is just as true, too, for the most developed phase of the credit system, which still has metallic circulation as its basis. On the one hand, the extra production of precious metals, according to whether this makes them abundant or scarce, can now exert a disturbing influence on the price of commodities, not only in the long term, but also within very short periods. On the other hand, the whole credit mechanism must constantly be engaged in restricting the actual circulation of metal by all kinds of operations, methods, technical devices, to what is relatively an ever-decreasing minimum, though this also increases in the same proportion the artificial character of the entire machinery and the chances of its normal course being disturbed. The various B's of Department 1, whose virtual new money capital comes into active operation, may reciprocally buy their products, parts of their surplus product, from one another, and sell to one another. To this extent, the money advanced for the circulation of the surplus product flows back to the different B's, in the normal course of events, in the same measure to which they advance this for the circulation of their respective commodities. If the money circulates as a means of payment, then there are only balances to be settled insofar as the reciprocal sales and purchases do not cover one another. It is important above all, however, to start by assuming metal circulation in its most simple original form, since in this way the flux or reflux, settlement of balances, in short, all those aspects that appear in the credit system as consciously regulated processes, present themselves as existing independently of the credit system, and the thing appears in its spontaneous form, instead of the form of subsequent reflection. Subsection C. The additional variable capital. Since we have so far dealt only with the additional constant capital, we now have to turn to consider the additional variable capital. In Volume 1, we explained at considerable length how, on the basis of capitalist production, labor power is always on hand, and how, if necessary, more labor can be extracted without an increase in the number of workers employed, or the mass of labor power. We do not have to go into this any further here, therefore, but can simply assume that the portion of the newly formed money capital that is convertible into variable capital always finds available the labor power into which it is to be transformed. We also considered in Volume 1 how a given capital can, within certain limits, expand its scale of production without accumulation. What we are dealing with now, however, is capital accumulation in the specific sense, where the expansion of production is conditioned by the transformation of surplus value into extra capital, and therefore by the expanded capital basis of production. The gold producer can accumulate a part of his gold in surplus value as virtual money capital. Once it attains the level needed, he can convert it directly into new variable capital, and in the same way convert it into elements of constant capital. In the latter case, however, he must find these material elements of his constant capital available, whether, as was assumed in the former presentation, each producer works to fill his stocks and then brings his finished commodities to the market, or whether he simply works to order. The real expansion of production, i.e. the surplus product, is presupposed in both cases, once as actually present, the other time as virtually present, capable of being supplied. Section 2. Accumulation in Department 2. We have assumed up to now that A prime, sell their surplus products to B prime, etc., who belong to the same Department 1. Say, however, that A of Department 1 converts his surplus product into money by selling it to B belonging to Department 2. This can only happen if A of Department 1, after he has sold means of production to B of Department 2, does not go on to buy means of consumption, i.e. only by a unilateral sale on his part. Now, inasmuch as the conversion of 2C from the form of commodity capital back into the natural form of productive constant capital involves not only the exchange of 1V, but also of at least a part of 1S for part of 2C, this 2C existing in the form of means of consumption, whereas A now realizes his 1S in money in a way that does not involve this exchange, but our A instead withdraws from circulation the money received from Department 2 by the sale of his 1S, rather than exchanging it in the purchase of means of consumption 2C, then although the formation of additional virtual money capital takes place on A's part, on the other side, an equal part of B2's constant capital is tied up in the form of commodity capital, incapable of conversion into the natural form of productive constant capital. In other words, a part of B2's commodities, and at first sight a part without selling which he cannot transform his constant capital completely back into the productive form, has become unsaleable. In this respect, there is overproduction, which also inhibits B2's reproduction, even on the same scale. In this case, therefore, although the additional virtual money capital on the part of A1 is the realized form of the surplus product, surplus value, surplus product considered as such is here a phenomenon of simple reproduction, and not yet of reproduction on an expanded scale. 1V plus S, at least a part of S being included here, must ultimately be exchanged against 2C, so that the reproduction of 2C can proceed on the same scale. A1, by selling its surplus product to B2, has supplied the latter with a corresponding portion of constant capital in the natural form, but at the same time made an equal portion of B2's commodity value unsaleable. If we bear in mind the total social reproduction, which includes both capitalists 1 and 2, then the transformation of A1's surplus product into virtual money capital expresses the non-transformability of a portion of commodity capital equal to this in value back into productive constant capital, i.e. not virtual production on an expanded scale, but rather a restriction of simple reproduction, i.e. a shortfall in simple reproduction. Since the formation and sale of A1's surplus product are themselves normal phenomena of simple reproduction, we have here, even on the basis of simple reproduction, the following mutually conditioning phenomena. Formation of virtual extra money capital in Department 1, hence underconsumption from Department 2's standpoint, piling up of commodity stocks in Department 2, which cannot be transformed back into productive capital, i.e. relative overproduction in Department 2, surplus money capital in Department 1, and a shortfall in reproduction in Department 2. Without delaying any longer on this point, we simply note that it was presupposed in our presentation of simple reproduction that the entire surplus value in Departments 1 and 2 was spent as revenue. In point of fact, however, one portion of surplus value is spent as revenue and another portion is transformed into capital. Only with this precondition does real accumulation take place. But the idea that accumulation is achieved at the expense of consumption, considered in this general way, is an illusion that contradicts the essence of capitalist production, inasmuch as it assumes that the purpose and driving motive of this is consumption, and not the grabbing of surplus value and its capitalization, i.e., accumulation. Let us now consider accumulation in Department 2 somewhat more closely. The first problem in relation to 2C, i.e. its transformation back from a component of commodity capital 2 into the natural form of Department 2's constant capital, concerns simple reproduction. Let us take the previous schema. 1000V plus 1000S of Department 1 is exchanged for 2000 2C. If half the surplus product of Department 1, i.e. 1000 over 2S or 500 1S, is now reincorporated into Department 1 as constant capital, then this part of the surplus product that is retained in Department 1 cannot replace any part of 2C. Instead of being converted into means of consumption, and in this section of the circulation between Departments 1 and 2 there is a genuine mutual exchange, i.e. a bilateral change of place by the commodities as distinct from the replacement of 1002C by 1001V, which was mediated by the workers in Department 1, it is to serve as additional means of production in Department 1 itself. It cannot perform this function simultaneously in both Departments 1 and Department 2. The capitalist cannot spend the value of his surplus product on means of consumption and at the same time himself productively consume the surplus product, i.e. incorporate it into his productive capital. Thus, instead of 2001V plus S, only 1500, i.e. 1000V plus 500S of Department 1 is available for conversion into 2002C, and so 502C can in fact not be transformed from its commodity form into productive capital. There would thus be an overproduction in Department 2, corresponding in value precisely to the expansion of production that took place in Department 1. The overproduction in Department 2 might in fact react so strongly on Department 1 that even the reflux of the 1,000 spent by the Department 1 workers on means of consumption 2 would take place only partially, so that this 1,000 would not return to the hands of the Department 1 capitalists in the form of variable money capital. The latter would thus be inhibited even in their reproduction on the same scale, and inhibited moreover by the very attempt to expand it. It should also be mentioned in this connection that all that has taken place in Department 1 is in fact simple reproduction, the elements merely being grouped together differently from the above schema in accordance with the needs of future expansion, say in the coming year. One might endeavor to circumvent this difficulty in the following way. The 502C lying in the capitalist stores, which cannot be directly converted into productive capital, is so far removed from being overproduction that it actually represents a necessary element of reproduction which we have up to now neglected. We saw how the piling up of money takes place at several points, so that the money has to be withdrawn from circulation, partly to make possible the formation of new money capital in Department 1 itself, partly to maintain the value of the fixed capital that is gradually being consumed for the time being in the money form. But since in this schema, all money and all commodities are from the start exclusively in the hands of the capitalists 1 and 2, and there are neither merchants nor money dealers involved, nor bankers, nor any classes that merely consume and are not directly involved in commodity production, it follows that the constant formation of commodity stocks is indispensable, in the hands of their respective producers themselves, in order to keep the machinery of reproduction going. The 502C lying in the stores of the Department 2 capitalists thus represents the commodity stock and means of consumption that ensures the continuity of the consumption process involved in reproduction, and therefore the transition from one year to the other. The consumption fund that is here still in the hands of its sellers, who are also its producers, cannot sink to nothing in the current year, to begin again from nothing the next year, any more than this can be the case in the passage from one day to the next. Since there must be a constant new formation of these commodity stocks, even if they change in extent, our capitalist producers in Department 2 must have a money reserve capital that enables them to continue their production process even though one part of their productive capital is temporarily tied up in the commodity form. Our assumption is that these capitals combine the whole business of trading with that of producing. They must therefore also have at their disposal the additional money capital which exists in the hands of the merchants once the individual functions of the reproduction process are made the independent functions of different sorts of capitalist. 1. The objection could be made that this stock formation and the need for it holds for all capitalists in both departments. Considered simply as sellers of commodities, these are distinguished only by the different kinds of commodities they sell. A stock of commodities in Department 2 implies a previous stock of commodities in Department 1. If we ignore this stock on one side, we must also ignore it on the other. But if we bring both sides into consideration, the problem is in no way changed. 2. Just as the current year concludes on the side of Department 2 with the commodity stock for the next, so it began with the commodity stock on the same side left over from the previous year. In analyzing the annual reproduction, reduced to its most abstract expression, we must thus cancel out the stock on both sides. If we leave the year in question with the whole of its production, and thus also that which it transfers as a commodity stock to the next year, we must deduct from this, on the other side, the commodity stock that it receives from the year before, and we thus have the total product of an average year as the object of our analysis. 3. The simple fact that we did not come up against the difficulty that is now to be overcome in considering simple reproduction shows that we are dealing here with a specific phenomenon that is due merely to the different arrangement of the elements of Department 1, as far as reproduction is concerned, an arrangement without which there could be no reproduction on an expanded scale at all. Section 3. Schematic presentation of accumulation. We shall now consider reproduction according to the following schema. Schema A. Department 1, 4000C plus 1000V plus 1000S totaling 6000, and Department 2, 1500C, 376V, and 376S totaling 2252. Total 8252. It will be seen immediately that the total sum of the annual social product, 8252, is smaller than in our original schema, where it was 9,000. We might just as well take a much larger sum, multiply it by 10, say, for all the difference it makes. The reason why a smaller sum has been chosen than in the earlier schema is precisely to draw attention to the fact that reproduction on an expanded scale, which is conceived here simply as production pursued with a greater investment of capital, has nothing to do with the absolute size of the product. That for a given volume of commodities, it simply assumes a different arrangement or different determination of the functions of the various elements of the given product, and is thus in the first instance only simple reproduction as far as its value goes. It is not the quantity but the qualitative character of the given elements of simple reproduction that is changed, and this change is the material precondition for the ensuing reproduction on an expanded scale. We could alternatively take a different schema, with different proportions between variable and constant capital, as for example schema B. Department 1, 4000C plus 875V plus 875S being 5750, and Department 2, 1750C plus 376V and 376S being 2502, the total being 8252. In this way, it would be arranged for reproduction on the same scale, with the surplus value being spent completely as revenue and not accumulated. In both case A and case B, we have an annual product of the same value, simply that in case B there is a functional arrangement of its elements such that reproduction begins again on the same scale, whereas in case A, this forms the material basis for reproduction on an expanded scale. In case B in particular, 875V and 875S of Department 1 being 1750V plus S is exchanged without a surplus for 1752C, while in case A, 1000V and 1000S of Department 1, being 2000V plus S, leaves behind, when exchanged for 1502C, a surplus of 501S for accumulation in Department 1. We must now analyze schema A more closely. Let us suppose that both in Department 1 and Department 2, half the surplus value, instead of being spent as revenue, is accumulated, i.e. is transformed into elements of additional capital. Since half of 1001S, being 500, is accumulated in one form or another to be invested as additional money capital, i.e. to be transformed into extra productive capital, it follows that only 1000V plus 500S of Department 1 is spent as revenue. Hence the normal size of 2C is now only 1500. The exchange between 1500 1V plus S and 1500 2C needs no further investigation, since it is already presented as a process of simple reproduction. Just as little does the 4001C come into consideration, since its rearrangement for the reproduction newly beginning, which takes place this time on an expanded scale, was similarly explained as a process of simple reproduction. All that remains to be investigated here, therefore, are the 501S and 376V and 376S of Department 2, which involves both the internal relations in the two departments and the movement between them. Since it is assumed that in Department 2 also, half of the surplus value is to be accumulated, it follows that 188 has here to be transformed into capital, 1/4 of this, or 47, into variable capital, say 48 for the sake of a round number, leaving 140 to be transformed into constant capital. Here we come up against a new problem, the very existence of which must appear remarkable for the current view that commodities of one kind are customarily exchanged for commodities of another kind. Ditto commodities for money, and the same money once again for commodities of a different kind. The 142s can be transformed into productive capital only by being replaced by a portion of commodities 1s to the same value. It is self-evident that the part of the 1s that is to be exchanged for 2s must consist of means of production, able to go either into the production of both departments or exclusively into that of Department 2. This exchange can take place only by a unilateral purchase on the part of Department 2, since the surplus product of 501s, which has still to be considered, is destined to serve for accumulation within Department 1, and cannot therefore be exchanged for commodities 2. In other words, Department 1 cannot at the same time both accumulate and consume the surplus product. Department 2 must therefore buy 140s for cash, without this money flowing back to it by the subsequent sale of its commodities to Department 1. And this is moreover a constant and repeated process for each new year's production, insofar as this is reproduction on an expanded scale. Where then in Department 2 is the source of money for this? Department 2 seems, on the contrary, a completely unprofitable field for the formation of new money capital that accompanies actual accumulation, and is a necessary condition for this in the case of capitalist production, where this accumulation actually presents itself at first as mere hoarding. We have, to start with, 376 2V. The money capital of 376 advanced for labor power constantly returns to the Department 2 capitalist as variable capital in the money form, with the purchase of Department 2's commodities. This constantly repeated removal from and return to the starting point, the capitalist pocket, in no way increases the amount of money driving round the circuit. So this is not a source of monetary accumulation, nor can this money be withdrawn from the circulation and hoarded up to form virtual new money capital. But wait a minute, isn't there a little profit to be made here? We must not forget that Department 2 has the advantage over Department 1, that the workers it employs have to buy back again from it the commodities they themselves have produced. Department 2 is not only a buyer of labor power, but at the same time a seller of commodities to the possessors of labor power it employs. Department 2, therefore, can, 1, and it has this in common with the capitalists in Department 1, simply reduce wages below their normal average level. In this way, a part of the money that functions as the money form of variable capital is set free, and this could, if the process is constantly repeated, become a normal source of hoard formation, and also, therefore, of the formation of virtual extra money capital in Department 2. Of course, we are not referring here to an occasional swindle, but rather to a normal process of capital formation. It should not be forgotten, however, that the normal wage which is actually paid, and which determines the size of the variable capital, other things being equal, is in no way paid out of the goodwill of the capitalists, but is what has to be paid under the given conditions. This mode of explanation is thereby dispensed with. If we take 376V as the variable capital to be spent by Department 2, we cannot suddenly insert the hypothesis that Department 2 advances only 350V and not 376 simply in order to solve the new problem that has just arisen. 2. On the other hand, however, Department 2, considered as a totality, has the advantage over Department 1, as we have already said, that it not only buys labor power but resells its commodities to its own workers. As to how this fact can be exploited, there are the most palpable data in every industrial country. Even if the normal wage is nominally paid, a part of it can in actual fact be grabbed back without a corresponding equivalent, in other words, stolen. This is achieved partly by way of the truck system and partly by falsification of the circulating medium, even if possibly in a way that circumvents the law. This is what happens in England and the USA, for example. The opportunity should be taken to expand on this somewhat with a few nice examples. However, this is the same operation as that in Case 1, only disguised and executed in a devious way. It must therefore be rejected here just like the previous case. What we are talking about here is the real wage, not that nominally paid. We see here that in an objective analysis of the capitalist mechanism, certain blemishes that still stick to it, and with extraordinary tenacity, cannot be used as subterfuges for getting around theoretical difficulties. But strange though this seems, the great majority of my bourgeois critics complain that I do the capitalist an injustice by assuming, in Volume 1 for example, that he pays the real value of labor power, which in most cases he does not. Here I might quote Schaffler with the magnanimity that he attributes to me. The 376 2V, therefore, does not get us any nearer the goal we have mentioned. However, the 376 2S seems to stand in an even more dubious position. Here, it is only the capitalist in the same department who confront one another, selling and buying from each other the means of consumption that they have produced. The money needed for this exchange functions simply as a means of circulation, and in the normal course it must flow back to the parties involved in the same degree to which they first advanced it to circulation, so that it can tread the same path once again. The withdrawal of this money from circulation for the formation of virtual additional money capital seems possible only in two ways. Firstly, one section of capitalists in Department 2 might swindle the others and rob them of their money. As we know, no preliminary expansion of the medium and circulation is necessary for the formation of new money capital. All that is needed is for money to be withdrawn at certain points and stored up as a hoard. The fact that the money can be stolen, and that the formation of additional money capital by one section of the capitalists in Department 2 can therefore be combined with the positive loss of money by another section, has absolutely no bearing on the matter. The defrauded section of Department 2 capitalists would have to live a little less extravagantly, but that would be all. Alternatively, a portion of 2S that represents necessary means of subsistence is directly transformed into new variable capital in Department 2. How this happens will be investigated at the close of the present chapter in Section 4. Subsection A. First example. Schema A. Schema of simple reproduction. Department 1, 4000C plus 1000V plus 1000S being 6000, and Department 2, 2000C plus 500V plus 500S being 3000, totaling 9000 altogether. Schema B. Initial schema for reproduction on an expanded scale. Department 1, 4000C plus 1000V plus 1000S being 6000, Department 2, 1500C plus 750V plus 750S being 3000, totaling 9000 altogether. If we assume that in Schema B, half of the surplus value in Department 1 is accumulated, i.e. 500, then we get in the first place 1000V plus 500S at Department 1, or 1500 1V plus S, to be replaced by 1502C. There then remains in Department 1 4000C plus 500S, the latter having to be accumulated. The replacement of 1000V and 500S of Department 1 by 1502C is a process of simple reproduction and has already been explained in connection with the latter. Let us assume that 400 of the 501S to be accumulated has to be transformed into constant capital and 100 into variable capital. The exchange within Department 1 of the 400S that has to be capitalized has already been explained, so that this can be annexed to 1C without any more ado, and we can get to the following capitalization for Department 1. 4400C plus 1000V in money plus 100S to be converted into 100V. Department 2, for its part, buys from Department 1 for the purpose of accumulation the 101S existing in means of production, which now forms an extra constant capital for Department 2, while the 100 in money that it pays for it is transformed into the money form of Department 1's extra variable capital. We then have for Department 1 a capital of 4400C plus 1100V, the latter in money, totaling 5500. Department 2 now has 1600C in constant capital, and a further 50V has to be added for the purchase of new labor power for working this up, and so its variable capital grows from 750 to 800. This extension of both Department 2's constant and variable capital is met out of its own surplus value. Of the 752S, therefore, there remains only 600S as a consumption fund for the Department 2 capitalists, whose annual product is now distributed as follows: 1600C plus 800V plus 600S, totaling 3000. The 150S produced in means of consumption that is converted here into 100C plus 50V of Department 2 goes completely into the workers' consumption in its natural form. 100 is consumed by the workers in Department 1, being 101V, and 50 by the workers in Department 2, being 52V, as elaborated above. In point of fact, the portion of surplus value that has to be reproduced in the form of necessary means of consumption in Department 2 is 100 greater when its total product is produced in the form needed for accumulation. When reproduction on an expanded scale gets underway, the Department 1's extra 100 variable money capital flows back to Department 2 through the hands of Department 1's working class. Department 2 in turn transfers 100S to Department 1 in a commodity stock, and at the same time 50 in a commodity stock to its own working class. The arrangement as changed for the purpose of accumulation now stands as follows: Department 1, 4400C, 1100V, and 500 being the capitalist consumption fund, totaling 6,000. Department 2, 1,600C plus 800V plus 600 being the capitalist consumption fund, totaling 3,000. The total, 9,000, as above. The capital in this is Department 1, 4,400C plus 1,100V, totaling 5,500, and Department 2, 1,600C plus 800V, totaling 2,400, the total aggregate being 7,900, whereas production began with Department 1 having 4,000C and 1,000V, totaling 5,000, and Department 2 having 1,500C plus 750V, totaling 2,250, with the total aggregate being 7,250. If real accumulation now proceeds on this basis, i.e. if production actually takes place with this increased capital, then we have at the end of the following year, Department 1, 4,400C plus 1,100V plus 1,100S, totaling 6,600, and Department 2, 1,600C plus 800V plus 800S, totaling 3,200, with the total aggregate of both departments being 9,800. Let accumulation now continue in Department 1 in the same proportions, i.e. 550S is spent as revenue and 550S accumulated. To start with then, 1,101V is replaced by 1,102C, and 551S remains to be realized in an equal amount of commodities too, i.e. altogether 1,650 1V plus S. But the constant capital in Department 2 that has to be exchanged is only 1,600, so that the remaining 50 must be supplemented from the 802S. If we initially leave aside the money here, then the result of this transformation is Department 1, 4,400C plus 550S, to be capitalized, as well as 1,650V plus S in the consumption fund for capitalists and workers, realized in Commodities 2C. Department 2, 1,650C, with 50 being added as above from 2S, plus 800V plus 750S, being the capitalist consumption fund. But if the former ratio of V to C in Department 2 remains unchanged, then a further 25V must be laid out for 50C. This has to be taken from the 750S. We therefore get 1,650C plus 825V plus 725S. In Department 1, 550S has to be capitalized. If the earlier ratio remains the same, then 440 of this forms constant capital and 110 variable capital. This 110 is ultimately obtained from the 725-2S, so that means of consumption to the value of 110 are consumed by the workers in Department 1 instead of by the capitalists in Department 2, the latter being forced to capitalize this 110S instead of consuming it. This leaves 615-2S over out of the 725-2S. But if Department 2 transforms this 110 into additional constant capital, it needs a further additional variable capital of 55. This has again to come out of its surplus value. Deducted from the 615-2S, it leaves 560 for the consumption of capitalists in Department 2. And we now get, after the completion of all actual and potential transfers, the following capital value. Department 1, 4,400C plus 440C plus 1,100V plus 110V, totaling 4,840C plus 1,210V with a total of 6,050. Department 2, 1,600C plus 50C plus 110C plus 800V plus 25V plus 55V, totaling 1,760C plus 880V with a total of 2,640 and a grand aggregated total of 8,690. If things are to proceed normally, accumulation in Department 2 must take place quicker than in Department 1, since the part of 1V plus S that has to be exchanged for Commodities 2C would otherwise grow more quickly than 2C, which is all that it can be exchanged for. If reproduction continues on this basis and other conditions remain the same, then we get, at the end of the following year, Department 1, 4,840C plus 1,210V plus 1,210S, totaling 7,260, and Department 2, 1,760C plus 880V plus 880S, totaling 3,520, with a grand total of 10,780. If the surplus value is partitioned in the same ratio, the Department 1 first has 1,210V plus half of S, being 605, to spend as revenue, a total of 1,815. This consumption fund is 55 greater again than 2C. The 55 has to be deducted from the 880S. The transformation of 55.2s into 1c presupposes a further deduction from 2s for a corresponding variable capital of 27 1/2. There remains 797 1/2 2s to be consumed. There is now 605s to be capitalized in Department 1, 484 of this for constant and 121 for variable. The latter has to be deducted from 2s, which is still 797 1/2, leaving 676 1/2. Thus, Department 2 transforms a further 121 into constant capital and needs for this purpose a further variable capital of 60 1/2. This similarly comes out of the 676 1/2, leaving 616 for consumption. We then have in capital Department 1, constant 4,840 plus 484, being 5,324, and variable 1,210 plus 121, being 1,331. Department 2, constant 1,760 plus 55 plus 121, being 1,936, and variable 880 plus 27 1/2 plus 60 1/2, being 968. Altogether, Department 1, 5,324c plus 1,331v, totaling 6,655. Department 2, 1,936c plus 968v, totaling 2,904, with a grand total of 9,559. And in products at the end of the year, Department 1, 5,324c plus 1,331v plus 1,331s, totaling 7,986, and Department 2, 1,936c plus 968v plus 968s, totaling 3,872, with a grand total of 11,858. Repeating the same calculation and rounding off the fractions, we get at the end of the following year a product of Department 1, 5,856c plus 1,464v plus 1,464s, with a total of 8,784. Department 2, 2,129c plus 1,065v plus 1,065s, totaling 4,259, with an aggregate total of 13,043. And at the close of the year after that, Department 1, 6,442c plus 1,610v plus 1,610s, totaling 9,662. Department 2, 2,342c plus 1,172v plus 1,172s, totaling 4,686, with a grand total of 14,348. In the course of 5 years of reproduction on an expanded scale, the total capital of Departments 1 and 2 has risen from 5,500c plus 1,750v, being 7,250, to 8,784c plus 2,782v, equaling 11,566, i.e. in a ratio of 100 to 160. The total surplus value was originally 1,750. It is now 2,782. The surplus value consumed was originally 500 for Department 1 and 600 for Department 2, a total of 1,100. In the final year, it is 732 for Department 1 and 745 for Department 2, altogether 1,477. It has thus grown in the ratio of 100 to 134. Subsection B. Second example. Let us now take an annual product of 9,000, existing entirely as commodity capital in the hands of the industrial capitals class, in a form in which the general average ratio of variable to constant capital, in both departments, is 1 to 5. This already presupposes a significant development of capitalist production and, accordingly, of the productivity of social labor as well, a significant prior expansion of the scale of production, and finally a development of all the circumstances that produce in the working class a relative surplus population. The annual product will then be divided up as follows, after rounding off the fractions. Department 1, 5,000c plus 1,000v plus 1,000s, totaling 7,000. Department 2, 1,430c plus 285v plus 285s, totaling 2,000, with a grand total of 9,000. Let us again take it that the capitalist class in Department 1 consumes half its surplus value, or 500, and accumulates the other half. In this case, 1000V and 500S of Department 1, totaling 1500, would need to be exchanged with 1500 2C. But since 2C is here only 1430, 70 of surplus value has to be added, and this, when deducted from the 285 2s, leaves 215 2s. We thus get Department 1, 5000C plus 500s, to be capitalized, plus 1500V plus S in the consumption fund for the capitalists and the workers. Department 2, 1430C plus 70s, later to be capitalized, plus 285V plus 215s. Since 72s has been directly annexed here to the 2C, a variable capital of 70 over 5, being 14, is required to set this extra constant capital in motion, since 14 has to come out of the 215 2s, leaving 201 2s, and we have Department 2, 1430C plus 70C plus 285V plus 14V plus 201s. The exchange of 1500 1V plus 1/2 S against 1500 2C is a process of simple reproduction, and nothing further need to be said about it. Insofar as there are still some peculiarities to be noted here, these stem from the fact that with accumulating reproduction, 1V plus 1/2 S is not just replaced by 2C alone, but rather by 2C plus a part of 2S. It is self-evident that on the assumption of accumulation, 1V plus S is greater than 2C, and not equal to it as in simple reproduction. Since Department 1 incorporates a part of its surplus product into its own productive capital, and transforms 5/6 of this into constant capital so that it cannot simultaneously exchange this 5/6 for means of consumption 2, and 2, Department 1 has to supply the material for the constant capital needed for accumulation within Department 2 out of its surplus product, just as Department 2 has to supply Department 1 with the material for the variable capital that is to set in motion the portion of its surplus product that Department 1 itself applies as extra constant capital. We know that variable capital actually consists of labor power, and so too, therefore, does this additional capital. It is not the capitalists in Department 1 who buy or store up means of subsistence from Department 2 for the additional labor power that they need to employ, as the slave owners had to do. It is the workers themselves who deal with Department 2. But this does not prevent the means of consumption for this additional labor power from being viewed by the capitalist as only so many means of production and maintenance for his potential additional labor power. His own immediate operation, in this case that of Department 1, simply consists in storing up the new money capital needed for the purchase of additional labor power. Once he has incorporated this labor power, the money becomes for the workers a means of purchase of commodities too, and they must therefore find their means of consumption to hand. Incidentally, Mr. Capitalist, as well as his press, is frequently discontented with the way in which labor power spends its money, and with the commodities too in which it realizes this. On this occasion, he philosophizes, waxes cultural, and philanthropizes, as for example Mr. Drummond, the British Secretary of Embassy in Washington. The Nation carried an interesting article last October, 1897, in which is said, among other things, quote, "The working people have not kept up in culture with the growth of invention, and they have had things showered on them which they do not know how to use, and thus make no market for." Every capitalist naturally wants the worker to buy his particular commodities. There is no reason why the working man should not desire as many comforts as the minister, lawyer, and doctor who is earning the same amount as himself. These particular ministers, lawyers, and doctors will certainly have to be satisfied merely with desiring many comforts. He does not do so, however. The problem remains how to raise him as a consumer by rational and healthful processes, not an easy one, as his ambition does not go beyond a diminution of his hours of labor, the demagogues rather inciting him to this than to raising his condition by the improvement of his mental and moral powers. End quote from reports of H.M. secretaries of embassy and legation on the manufacture, commerce, etc. of the countries in which they reside, published in London, 1879. Long hours of labor seem to be the secret of these rational and healthful processes, which are to raise the condition of the worker by improving his mental and moral powers and making a rational consumer out of him. In order to become a rational consumer of the capitalist commodities, he must before all else, but the demagogues prevent him, begin by letting his own labor power be consumed irrationally and in a way contrary to his own health by the capitalist who employs him. What the capitalist understands by rational consumption is shown when he is condescending enough to take a direct interest in the consumer behavior of his workers, i.e. in the truck system, which even includes the supply of housing to the workers involved so that the capitalist is simultaneously their landlord, one line of business among many others. The same Drummond whose fine soul enthuses for capitalist attempts at raising the level of the working class tells us in this report, among other things, about the model cotton factories of Lowell and Lawrence Mills. The boarding and lodging houses for the factory girls here belong to the joint stock company that owns the factory. The stewardesses of these houses are in the employment of the same company, which prescribes them certain rules of conduct. No girl may return home after 10 p.m. A particular gem is that a special police force patrols the area to prevent this regulation from being transgressed. After 10 p.m., no girl is allowed in or out. No girl may lodge anywhere but on the company's land, and each house brings in some $10 a week in rent. We now see the rational consumer in all his or her glory. Quote, as the ever-present piano is, however, to be found in many of the best appointed working girls' boarding houses, music, song, and dance come in for a considerable share of the operative's attention, at least among those who, after 10 hours steady work at the looms, need more relief from the monotony than actual rest. End quote. But the chief clue as to how to make the workers into rational consumers only comes at the end. Mr. Drummond visits the cutlery factory at Turner's Falls, in Connecticut River, and Mr. Oakman, the company secretary, after telling him how American cutlery beats English in quality, continues, quote, the time is coming that we will beat England as to prices also. We are ahead in quality now, that is acknowledged, but we must have lower prices, and shall have it the moment we get our steel at lower prices and have our labor down. End quote. Reduction in wages and long working hours. This is the kernel of the rational and healthful process that is to raise the workers to the dignity of rational consumers, so that they make a market for the things showered on them by civilization and the progress of invention. Just as Department 1 has to supply the additional constant capital for Department 2 out of its surplus product, so Department 2 supplies in the same way the extra variable capital for Department 1. Department 2 accumulates both for Department 1 and for itself, as far as the variable capital is concerned, inasmuch as it reproduces a larger portion of its total production, and of its surplus product in particular, in the form of necessary means of consumption. With production on an increasing capital basis, 1V plus S must be equal to 2C, plus the part of the surplus product that is reincorporated as capital, plus the extra portion of constant capital needed to expand production in Department 2, and the minimum for this expansion is that without which genuine accumulation, i.e. the actual extension of production in Department 1, cannot be carried out. Let us now return to the case last considered, which has the peculiarity that 2C is smaller than 1V plus 1/2 S, i.e. smaller than the part of the product of Department 1 that is spent as revenue on means of consumption, so that a part of the surplus product of Department 2, being 70, has to be realized in order to convert the 1500 1V plus S. As far as 2C, being 1430, is concerned, with circumstances remaining otherwise the same, it must be replaced by the same amount from 1V plus S for simple reproduction to take place in Department 2, and to this extent it does not need further consideration. It is different for the supplementary 72S. What is for Department 1 simply the exchange of revenue for means of consumption, merely a commodity exchange oriented to consumption, is now for Department 2 not just, as with simple reproduction, the transformation of its constant capital back from the form of commodity capital into its natural form, but rather the actual process of accumulation itself, the transformation of a part of its surplus product from the form of means of consumption into that of constant capital. If Department 1 uses £70 in money, its money reserved for the exchange of surplus value, to buy the 72S, and Department 2 does not use this money to buy the 71S, but accumulates the £70 as money capital, this latter is certainly still the expression of an extra product, precisely of the surplus product of Department 2, of which it is an aliquot part, even if it is not of a product that goes back again into the production sphere. But then this money accumulation on the part of Department 2 would be at the same time the expression of an unsaleable 71S in means of production. There would thus be relative overproduction, corresponding to the simultaneous non-expansion of production on the part of Department 2. But apart from this, during the time in which the £70 in money that came from Department 1 has not yet returned, or only partly returned to Department 1 by the purchase of 71S on the part of Department 2, this £70 in money figures completely or in part as additional virtual money capital in the hands of Department 2. This holds for each transaction between the two departments, until the mutual replacement of commodities on both sides has effected the reflux of the money to its starting point. In the normal course of events, however, the money figures only temporarily here in this role. In the credit system, where all additional money temporarily set free can immediately function actively as additional money capital, this money capital that is only released temporarily may get stuck, and may be used for new enterprises in Department 1, for example, whereas it ought to be used to set in motion surplus products still held down in other enterprises. It should also be noted that the annexation of 71S to the constant capital of Department 2 also requires an expansion of 14 in Department 2's variable capital. This presupposes, similarly to the case of direct incorporation of the surplus product 1S into capital 1C in Department 1, that reproduction in Department 1 is already proceeding with a tendency to further capitalization, and that it therefore involves the expansion of that part of the surplus product that consists of necessary means of subsistence. As we already saw, the product of 9,000 in the second example must be divided as follows for the purpose of reproduction if 501S is to be capitalized. Here we simply consider the commodities and ignore the monetary circulation. Department 1, 5,000C plus 500S to be capitalized, plus 1,500V plus S being a consumption fund, totaling 7,000 in commodities. Department 2, 1,500C plus 299V plus 201S, totaling 2,000 in commodities. A total of 9,000 in commodity product. The capitalization now proceeds as follows. The 500S that is capitalized in Department 1 is divided into 5/6, being 417C plus 1/6, being 83V. The 83V withdraws an equal amount from 2S, which buys elements of constant capital added to 2C. An increase of 83 in 2C necessitates an increase of 1/5 of 83, or 17, in 2V. We then have, after the exchange, Department 1, 5,000C plus 417S being the constant capital, plus 1,000V plus 83S being the variable capital, totaling 5,417C plus 1,083V, equaling 6,500. Department 2, 1,500C plus 83S being the constant capital, plus 299V plus 17S being the variable capital, totaling 1,583C, equaling 316V, equaling 1,899. Altogether, 8,399. The capital in Department 1 has grown from 6,000 to 6,500, i.e. by 1/12. In Department 2, it has grown from 1,715 to 1,899, i.e. by almost 1/9. Reproduction on this basis for a second year produces at the end of the year a capital of Department 1, 5,417C plus 452S being the constant capital, plus 1,083V plus 90S being the variable capital, equaling 5,869C plus 1,173V being 7,042. Department 2, 1,583C plus 42S plus 90S being the constant capital, plus 316V plus 8S plus 18S being the variable capital, equaling 1,715C plus 342V, totaling 2,057. And at the end of the third year, a product of Department 1, 5,869C plus 1,173V plus 1,173S, and in Department 2, 1,715C plus 342V plus 342S. Here, as before, Department 1 accumulates half its surplus value, so that 1V plus 1/2 S equals 1,173V plus 587 1/2 S, totaling 1,760, bigger by 45 than the total 2C. This must again be balanced with 2C by transferring an equal amount of means of production to 2C. 2C thus grows by 45, which requires an increase of 1/5 times 45, totaling 9, in 2V. The capitalized 587 1S then divides into 5/6 and 1/6, being 489C and 98V. This 98 requires a new addition of 98 to Department 2's constant capital, and this in turn an increase in Department 2's variable capital of 1/5 times 98 being 20. We now have Department 1, 5,869C plus 489S being the constant capital, plus 1,173V plus 98S being the variable capital, totaling 6,358C plus 1,271V with a total of 7,629. In Department 2, 1,715C plus 45S plus 98S being the constant capital, plus 342V plus 9S plus 20S being the variable capital, totaling 1,858C plus 371V, totaling 2,229, with the total capital being 9,858. In 3 years of increased reproduction, therefore, the total capital of Department 1 has grown from 6,000 to 7,629, that of Department 2 from 1,715 to 2,229, and the total social capital from 7,715 to 9,858. Subsection C. The exchange of 2C in the case of accumulation. There are several different cases in the exchange between 1V plus S and 2C. In the case of simple reproduction, the two must be equal and replace one another. Otherwise, as we have seen above, simple reproduction cannot proceed undisturbed. In the case of accumulation, the principal thing to be considered is the rate of accumulation. In the above examples, we assume that the rate of accumulation in Department 1 was 1/2 1s, and that it remained constant in different years. We simply changed the proportions according to which this accumulated capital was divided into variable and constant. This gave us the three examples, one being Department 1's V plus 1/2 S being equal to 2C, which is thus smaller than 1V plus S. In fact, it must always be smaller or else Department 1 cannot accumulate. And 2. 1V plus 1/2 S being greater than 2C. In this case, the replacement is effected by a corresponding portion of 2S being added to 2C, so that this sum equals 1V plus 1/2 S. Here the exchange is not for Department 2 the simple reproduction of its constant capital, but already accumulation, the increase of its constant capital by a part of its surplus product, which it exchanges for means of production from Department 1. This increase also means that Department 2 correspondingly enlarges its variable capital out of its own surplus product. 3. 1V plus 1/2 S is smaller than 2C. In this case, Department 2 has not completely reproduced its constant capital by the exchange, and must therefore make up the deficiency by purchase from Department 1. But this does not require any further accumulation of variable capital in Department 2, since its constant capital is fully reproduced in magnitude by this operation. On the other hand, the section of capitalists in Department 1 that is simply storing up additional money capital has already accomplished one part of this kind of accumulation by this exchange. The precondition for simple reproduction, that 1V plus S is equal to 2C, is incompatible with capitalist production from the start, although this does not rule out the possibility that in 1 year of the industrial cycle, of 10 to 11 years, there may be a smaller total production than the preceding, i.e. that even simple reproduction fails to take place in relation to the previous year. Secondly, however, given the natural annual growth of the population, simple reproduction would mean that a proportionately greater number of unproductive servants had to share in the 1,500 that represents the total surplus value. Accumulation of capital, i.e. genuine capitalist production, would be impossible in this way. The existence of capitalist accumulation accordingly excludes the possibility that 2C may be equal to 1V plus S. Yet even with capitalist accumulation, the case could arise in which, as a result of the accumulation achieved in the previous run of production periods, 2C was not only equal to 1V plus S, but in fact even greater. This would mean overproduction in Department 2, and could only be balanced out by a major crash, as a result of which capital would be transferred from Department 2 to Department 1. Nothing is altered in the relation between 1V plus S and 2C if a section of the constant capital in Department 2 is reproduced there, as in agriculture, for example, with the employment of homegrown seed. This part of 2C is then as little involved in the exchange between Departments 1 and 2 as is 1C. It also makes no difference if some of the products of Department 2 are capable of entering Department 1 as means of production. This is covered by a part of the means of production supplied by Department 1, and this part must be deducted from both sides at the outset if we want to investigate the exchange between the two great departments of social production, the producers of means of production and the producers of means of consumption, in its pure and unadulterated form. In the case of capitalist production, therefore, 1V plus S cannot be equal to 2C, i.e. the two cannot balance each other out in the exchange. It is possible, on the other hand, if 1S over X is the part of 1S that is spent by the capitalist of Department 1 as revenue, for 1V plus S over X to be equal to, greater, or less than 2C. However, 1V plus S over X must always be smaller than 2C plus S, and indeed smaller by the part of 2S that the capitalist class in Department 2 must itself, under all circumstances, consume. We have to note here that in this presentation of accumulation, the value of the constant capital is not depicted exactly, insofar as this is a portion of the value of the commodity capital in whose production it collaborates. The fixed part of the newly accumulated constant capital only grows gradually and periodically into the commodity capital, according to the differential nature of these fixed elements. The commodity capital therefore consists, in those cases in which raw materials and semi-finished goods, etc., are involved in commodity production on a large scale, for the most part, of replacements for the circulating constant components and for the variable capital. However, we were able to proceed in this manner on account of the turnover of the circulating components. The assumption was thereby made that the circulating part, together with the portion of value that the fixed capital surrendered to it, turns over within the year, with such a frequency that the total sum of commodities supplied is the same as the value of the whole of the capital that goes into the annual production. But where, as with construction of machinery, it is only ancillaries that are involved, and not raw material, the labor element being V must again appear as a larger component of the commodity capital. For the rate of profit, the surplus value is calculated on the total capital, independently of whether the fixed components surrender a great deal of value to the product in a given period or only a little. But for the value of any commodity capital periodically produced, the fixed part of the constant capital has only to be taken into account to the extent that it actually gives up value to the product by its average wear and tear. Section 4. Supplementary Remarks. The original source of money for Department 2 is the V plus S of the gold production in Department 1, exchanged against the part of 2C. It is only to the extent that the gold producers store up surplus value or transform it into means of production in Department 1, i.e. extend their production, that their V plus S does not go into Department 2. On the other hand, as far as accumulation of money by the gold producers themselves finally leads to expanded reproduction, a portion of the surplus value from gold production that is not spent as revenue goes into Department 2 for the gold producers' additional variable capital, and either requires a new hoard formation here or provides new means for buying from Department 1 without directly selling to it again. From the money that stems from this 1V plus S in gold production, a part of the gold is deducted that is needed by certain branches of production in Department 2 as raw material, etc., in short as a replacement element of their constant capital. In the exchange between Departments 1 and 2, there is an element for provisional hoard formation, for the purpose of future expanded reproduction as follows. In Department 1, only if a part of 1S is unilaterally sold to Department 2 without a purchase from the other side, and serves here as additional constant capital for Department 2. In Department 2, if Department 1 buys unilaterally for additional variable capital. Furthermore, if a part of the surplus value spent by Department 1 as revenue is not covered by Department 2, so that a part of 2S is bought with it and thereby transformed into money. If 1V plus S over X is greater than 2C, then 2C, for its simple reproduction, does not have to replace, in commodities from Department 1, what 1 consumed from 2S. The question then arises as to how far hoard formation can take place in exchange among the capitalists of Department 2 themselves, an exchange that can consist only of the mutual exchange of 2S. We know that within Department 2, there is only direct accumulation insofar as a part of 2S is directly transformed into variable capital, just as in Department 1, a part of 1S is directly transformed into constant capital. Given the different ages of accumulation within the various lines of business in Department 2, and within each particular line of business for the individual capitalists involved there, the matter is explained, mutatis mutandis, just as in Department 1. Some of these capitalists are still at the stage of hoard formation, selling without buying, while others, at the point of actual expansion of reproduction, buy without selling. The additional variable money capital is currently laid out at first on additional labor power, but this is used by means of subsistence from the hoard-forming proprietors of the extra means of consumption that go into the workers' consumption. In proportion to their hoard formation, this money does not return from these proprietors to its starting point. They store it up. End of Volume 2.